Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Welcome to this Fulbright-CSIS-USINDO panel discussion on politics and religion in Indonesia. My name is Mita, Associate Communications Officer at Aminef, and I will be your Master of Ceremonies for this event. Today's program will be as follows. Remarks from Dr. Phillips Vermonte, CSIS Executive Director, opening remarks by Mr. Alan Feinstein, Aminef's Executive Director, followed by the panel discussion and Q&A on the topic. We also would like to inform you that this event is made available for live streaming at CSIS Indonesia YouTube account. Now, let's start the proceedings. I would like to invite the Executive Director of CSIS, who is a Fulbright alumnus, Dr. Phillips Vermonte, to give his remarks.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to welcome you all to CSIS. I've seen some familiar faces. Being a Fulbright alumni, I will forever be grateful for the scholarship, but that will not prevent me and the other alumni to be critical as well, Pak, if we may. Now, we are going to have a discussion on state and religion in Indonesia, and when the Pa Alan Feinstein of the Aminef contacted us, I replied immediately, agreed upon, because we at CSIS also concerned about the topic, and given the fact that we've been in this mood of election years, and of course the question of religion and the state always comes up, as we know, but it seems to me that we need a thorough thinking whether or not this is actually a temporal phenomenon or is it going to be a continued phenomenon. Either one, I think this discussion today would give us some perspective on the matter, because we do have 4 able speakers who've been researching the topic for quite a long time, and then I will introduce them later. But to reiterate the MC earlier, that this event is a joint collaboration, a joint project of event between CSIS and Aminef, Fulbright, and USINDO, the 3 of which have been collaborating in the past, and I should say we are ready for more cooperation and collaboration with Aminef and Fulbright. I hope today's discussion will be enlightening for us and to give us some food for thought, of course, for a future agenda of research in particular, because we at CSIS, as well as the speakers, are academics, and then hopefully we can provide some kind of a helicopter view about what has been going on regarding the question of the state and religion and politics in Indonesia. Thank you very much once again for coming, and please enjoy the discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Phillips Vermonte, for the remarks. And now I would like to invite the Executive Director of Aminef, who is also a Fulbright alumnus, Mr. Alan Feinstein.
Oh, now it's on, sorry, I had to turn it on. All right, welcome, good afternoon, selamat siang. I'm Alan Feinstein, the director of Aminef, which is the Fulbright Commission in Indonesia. On behalf of Aminef, I want to welcome you all here and to thank our host and co-sponsor today, CSIS, and its executive director, Dr. Phillips Vermonte, which has kindly provided its splendid facilities here and graciously supplied our lunch for those who arrived in time for lunch. I also want to thank the third co-sponsor, the U.S.-Indonesia Society, or USINDO, whose director, Ambassador David Merrill, unfortunately cannot join us here. Both Dr. Phillips and Ambassador Merrill responded quickly, as Philip just said, and enthusiastically to the initial suggestion that our three organizations collaborate in holding this public discussion today on religion and politics in Indonesia. It's fair to say that all three of our organizations are eager to increase informed, evidence-based public discussion on matters of common interest in Indonesia and the US. CSIS is Indonesia's leading policy-oriented institute, was recently named by the Lander Institute at the University of Pennsylvania as the top think tank in Southeast Asia. And, give them my congratulations for that honor of being so named this year. It has historically been the source of useful published research on economic, political, and social issues, and is very well known for public platforms for discussions of important policy matters in Indonesia. USINDO was founded to enhance mutual understanding of Indonesia and the United States and to deepen the relationship between the two countries and their peoples. Its Council on Religion and Pluralism was set up in 2016 for prominent leaders in both countries to cooperate on activities and programs to share and promote the values of pluralism, diversity, and tolerance. AMINEF, as you know, and as I said before, manages the Fulbright program in Indonesia, which has been going on for 66 years now. 66 years, it's opened up opportunities for Indonesians to study and do research in the US, and for Americans to come to Indonesia to study, teach, and do research as well. Fulbright around the world is the primary means of people-to-people exchange between Americans and those in other countries. Equally important, Fulbrighters also create and disseminate knowledge, work on important issues in science, social science, humanities, and the arts that affect all of our societies and make important contributions in the public sphere. Thus, AMINEF is eager to provide public platforms for current grantees and alumni to contribute as public intellectuals to forums such as this one today. Indonesian Fulbrighters are prominent in government, the private sector, NGOs, and universities, and we're pleased to have several alumni participating here today, and I see many in the audience as well. American Fulbrighters who have been to Indonesia make up the bulk of the Indonesianist community in American universities, and you find them also in government service, in philanthropy, and the private sector. Current US Fulbright scholar Ronald Bull, professor at the University of North Florida, who originally did his dissertation research in Indonesia more than a decade ago, is back this year carrying out research on Banser and U, and we're interested to hear his take on today's panel. Speaking of Fulbright alumni, our host and moderator and CSIS Executive Director, Dr. Philip Tramonte, is himself a Fulbrighter, having received a grant to study at Northern Illinois University for his doctorate in political science. And as some of you may know, he's also an avid collector of heavy metal on vinyl and indulges his passion whenever he goes back to the US. Okay, our topic today is broadly characterized as religion and politics, the relative place of religion and arguments and policies based on religion in the political sphere has become a contentious issue, as emphasized in the recent gubernatorial elections in Jakarta in 2017 and the 2019 presidential and legislative election that was just completed. The treatment of religious and other minorities is also a persistent issue in public debate. Religion also gets notoriously invoked by organized or individual perpetrators of violence and terrorism, as recent events in Pittsburgh, San Diego, Christchurch, and Colombo tragically show. The 5 experts that we've invited here today Each comes at these issues from a different and unique angle, and we hope this will be a lively discussion among them and will allow for interactions with you in the audience after their presentations. I'll leave it to Dr. Phillips Framonte to do the introductions of each one of them and to himself provide reactions, and we look forward to his contribution as well to the discussion. So please join me in showing appreciation for Dr. Phillips Framonte, CSIS, and our invited panelists.
Thank you, Pak Alan, for the opening remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I would like to invite our moderator of the panel discussion, Dr. Phillips Framonte.
Thank you, MC. I'd like to invite all the speakers to come to the stage. Professor Ronald Lukansbo and Dr. Ahmad Munjid, Ms. Nafa, Ms. Titi Anggraini, and Mr. Nori Oktariza. Please be careful with the seat, not to slide to the back. Let us start the discussion. By way of introduction, I'd like to approach the problem by discussing my own observation about what has been going on, particularly since the Jakarta governor election in 2017. As we know, some have referred to this event in 2017 as a kind of an event that shows the increasing, to some observer, increasing conservatism in Indonesia that melted into the Indonesian politics. If you remember or follow the Indonesian news in 2017, there were, for example, banners across the city in 2017 during the election, stating that if you are voting for at the time the governor, incumbent Ahok, if you die you would not be buried here, or you would not be taken care of by the community, and so on and so forth. It just so happened that at one night during those days, I was preparing a material for my lecture the next day. I was teaching a graduate class at the one university in Jakarta, and then I come across this reading by Herb Fates explaining about the Indonesian politics back in the 1950s. And one of the footnotes in that reading, interestingly, was a quote from the work of the great anthropologist Clifford Geertz. And then in his book, the title was Rituals and Social Change, if I'm not mistaken. And Geertz was describing what happened in the village where he lived in. He studied Indonesia and lived in in Pare and Kediri. So in that book, he described an event on July 12, 1957, in the village where he lived. And it was the death of a young man, the villagers. But he was a member of the umbrella organization of the Indonesian Communist Party, PKI. And the Kiais and the people in the village refused to bury him. And that was July 12, 1957. And when I was reading that, it was February 2017 in Jakarta. So there was this 50 years apart from that event that was described by Clifford Geertz in 1957 and what happened in Jakarta in 2017. So the question to me at that night was that maybe we've been progressing, but because of the election, we are regressing back, or something have never changed in some aspects of our religious life and the relationship between religion and politics in Indonesia. So with that kind of introduction, I hope all the speakers, speakers here, would have their takes on what has been going on in Indonesia. They may take a long shot from 1950s, or they can just speak about the current event, the Indonesian election, and so on and so forth. I leave it to them, but maybe from the floor later on we will have a more rich discussion. Now, the first speaker would be Professor Ronald Lucas-Bull. He's the 2018 U.S. Fulbright Senior Scholars. He's a professor of anthropology and religious studies at University of North Florida. And the second speaker would be Dr. Ahmad Munjid, a longtime friend. He's a lecturer and researcher at Gajah Mada University. He studied his master's degree on religious studies at Temple University in Philadelphia. And the third speaker, we have Ms. Nafa Nurania. Those of you who are following the issue and study about radicalism, terrorism, conservatism in Indonesia might already know her. She has produced a lot of studies for the Institute for Policy Analysis of Conflicts, IPAC, in Jakarta. And the fourth speaker is Mr. Nuri Oktariza. He's a Young Turks at CSIS. He's a 2014 Fulbright alumnus. He did his master's degree in political science from Ohio University. And last but not least, Ibu Titi Anggraini, the executive director of Perludem, the Perkumpulan untuk Pemilu and Democracy. She is a well-known face, and her thoughts we've engaged so much about the election, and especially on the female and politics, women and politics in Indonesia. I believe she will touch upon on that issue as well. Now, without further ado, I'd like to invite Ronald. Each of you, I'll give 10 minutes, and I'll be kind of strict in the timing, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you, thank Aminef and CSIS and USINDO for putting this on. And since I only have 10 minutes, that's about all the Sompan Santun I'm going to do. I actually wrote down notes and then I left them promptly in the other room. So, I've got basically 2 points, I had 2 Roman numerals in those notes. One concerns the question of polarization, and the other includes the question of influence without power. So first, about the question of polarization. There was a lot of talk about religious polarization, and I'm not sure it's accurate, and I'm not sure it's accurate for a couple of reasons. So let's just assume for a second we're talking there are 2 poles. There is the moderate pole that backed Jokowi, and the not-so-moderate pole that backed Prabowo. Well, with the not-so-moderate pole that backed Prabowo, 3 prominent groups, what used to be called HTI, PKS, and FPI, these are takfiri groups who call each other kafir. There is, at most, I think, a temporary alliance to maybe oppose all things touched by Ahok. Then that would include Jokowi. If Prabowo would have won, then without a common enemy, they might start. Just religiously keep in mind that, like, what FPI does for religious purposes, the Tahlilan, Ziarah, the other groups called Bid'ah and Shirk. So, this is polarization. I'm not sure that that pole is unified. Now, let's take a look at the other pole, and I'm going to focus on NU because I've been with NU mostly for the last 6-7 months. Exit polls, 55% of people associated with NU voted Jokowi, which means 45% voted Prabowo. So that label, NU, is not meaningful politically. You know, because, now, yes, there were posters that said if you're a NU, you have to support, you have to vote for the ulama. Actually, they rarely said vote for Jokowi. You have to vote for the Kiai, or for the ulama. So, but one of the interesting differences between 2014 and 2019 with Gepe Ansar and Bansar is in 2014, all these events had a call for Salam Dua Jari, which was Jokowi's sign at the time. None of the events that I went to that were specifically Ansar, Bansar events had calls for Salam Satu Jari. None. Photo sessions in 2014, put up your two fingers. Everyone does it. If anyone, in 2019, if anyone called for the Jokowi sign, and it rarely happened, people would say, no, no, Salam Jari Satu, Salam Commando. And so we do this. So I haven't quite fully analyzed what that means, but it means in practice, at least that section of NU really didn't want to deal with the elections. They weren't backing either, per se. And again, I haven't fully figured out what that means. Maybe my colleagues can help me think about this a little bit. So that's my point on polarization. Now, the other point is related, is that the level of influence that, I like the term, I'm borrowing and modifying a term from Farid Al-Attas for what we often call Islamists, and that is, he calls them behaviorists, people who are concerned about religious behavior, moral behavior, their behavior, but other people's behavior being them. And I also sometimes think of them as being restrictive. So restrictive behaviorists, the people who are interested in restricting their behavior and other people's behavior. And the and other people's behavior is the important distinction from other religious expressions in Indonesia. And to have the influence, so if we remember back a decade to when Sharia parties held about 14% of the seats, that a legislation that didn't really have any teeth, really hasn't been super enforced, the anti-pornography law passed. Who's going to be pro-pornography? More recently, a law, about 4 or 5 years ago, the ban on selling beer at mini-marts passed. The restrictive behaviorists are able to introduce into public discourse small incremental restrictions. And it's the so-called moderates have a hard time opposing, again, which politician is going to run on beer for everyone, here at least. I mean, in the United States, we always talk about which candidate we'd want to have beer with. So, that would work in the U.S., but it doesn't work here. And so, and my friend and colleague and actually former teacher, Mark Woodward, said, oh, see, the election shows that religion isn't shaping politics because Prabowo didn't win. And I said, yeah, but what about this factor, the fact that this group got enough votes that they can push small incremental bits of Sharia. I know that term requires definition, and I'm not going to define it. That's why I did the air quotes. But small bits of restrictive legislation That, and by the way, oftentimes these restrictive legislation only impacts the lowest class, right? If you've got money, you can still get beer and whiskey. If you can afford to shop at Grand Indonesia, you can get any alcohol you want. And, you know, and what's interesting is I've actually had Kiai friends tell me they oppose this legislation because now the poor people are drinking oplosan and dying or going blind. And so, you know, again, that's kind of maybe a moderate perspective too, or a perspective that says it is better to tell people and encourage people to do the right thing rather than legislate the right thing. By trying to legislate the right thing, first of all, people aren't doing the right thing because it's the right thing. They're doing the right thing because they can't do anything else. And two, the alternatives can be more dangerous. And so, you know, I do see there's the distinction between sort of the restrictive and non-restrictive, but I'm not, again, not sure that polarization is what we need to think. There is a third poll that thankfully only achieved about 20% representation or non-representation, and that's Golput. In the United States, in our last presidential election, we had 42% of Americans not vote, which means that Donald Trump, you know, oh, Donald Trump only has 30% approval rating. Well, that's his base. That's all he needs is 30%. Because half of the actual electorate is only 30% of the population. So I think the group that we're not talking about, and we need to think about if they get any bigger here in Indonesia, now they're not very big, but is Golput. Because if a Golput gets bigger, then the politicians have to appeal to increasingly smaller groups of voters. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ron, and thank you for keeping up with the time. For sure, there will be questions later on. Now, I'd like to invite Dr. Ahmad Munjid for his 10 minutes time.
Thank you very much, Mas Philip. First of all, I want to thank AMINEF, USINDO, and CSIS for including me in this exciting session. My presentation today would be the question of identity politics in 2019 election. This is safer for me rather than providing the answer for the problem of identity politics. So I would like to raise some question and hoping that probably together we can find some answers. All right, we have just finished with, you want to move on with? Go ahead. We just have finished with the election that got wide appreciation across the globe, that in general the election was successful and peaceful with decisive result for both came actually in different meaning. But then the question for us is, with all of that we have, do now we have stronger democracy, or actually, to continue the discussion by Pak Ronald, divided nation? Because, you know, the voter turnout is very high, more than 80%. And then that means that public participation in the election was very, very high. But then, from time to time, even when the election is already done, people still call each other cebong and kampret, including ulama cebong and ulama kampret, you know, the Muslim scholar cebong and kampret. So the problem of polarization is really visible. And it became worse because the one group called the other as irreligious, anti-Islam in particular, you know. And the other call the other group as immoral and anti-diversity, both of which considered as very serious threat, not only to their group, but also to the entire nation. And that's happened exactly because politics and religion mix. And you know that when politics and religion are mixed, they're like oil and fire. They create more flame than light. So that's the reason why we have this problem. And then I just borrowed this data from Mas Philip and others. When we pay attention to the result of the election, the voters' profile, if we see them by religion, it is very interesting that 51% Muslims voted for Jokowi, 49% voted for Prabowo. But remember that this Muslim consists of 87%, the largest portion of the population. So what happened to them means a lot. And when we look at what happened to non-Muslim, 97% non-Muslim voted for Prabowo. For Jokowi, sorry. And 3%, only 3% voted for Prabowo. So by looking at this number alone, we can sense something. Then if we go by ethnic, Javanese, 65% voted for Jokowi and 35% for Prabowo. But again, Javanese ethnic group consists of 40% of the population. So what happened to them means a lot to the entire population. And if you pay attention to the other ethnic groups, Sundanese, Maduris, Betawi, Minang, Acehnese, most voted for Prabowo. And this ethnic group is identified, they have been identified as ethnic group with strong Islamic identity. So Mas Philip is from Minang. Yeah. I don't accuse him of being part of this, but it is very, very interesting. In the past, in 1955 election, this ethnic group are supporter of Masyumi. So West Java and Sumatra and also South Kalimantan and South Sulawesi, they're like the base for Masyumi, the stronghold for Masyumi. So what does it mean? And if we look at, this is the data from Mas Philip, voter by province, you can see how the vote is distributed in relation to the previous categories that I've provided, based on ethnic group as well as on religion. It is interesting that in Sumatra, Jokowi won in Lampung, and we know that in Lampung, many Javanese live there. In West Java, Prabowo won, but if you go to Cirebon, to Indramayu, where many Javanese live, Jokowi wins. So there is something here. When we see Islam, ethnic group, especially Java, and other ethnic group with strong Islamic identity in their political preference related to the presidential election. Okay, so clearly identity politics is very strong problem in this election and the previous election. By identity politics, I mean exploitation of exclusive identity, like religion, ethnicity, race, social groups, and other, for political mobilization. The question is why it looks more effectively works now. What's going on? To answer that question, we can move from two directions, from the from the bigger picture. Globalization, we know. Initially, some scholars believe that globalization means the easier and faster and more intensive movement across borders. of people, ideas, goods, money, etc. However, in later observation, we know that globalization also means deeper fraction because of the changing of landscape by the migration of people, also the flow of ideas, money, and others. The landscape of the people changed. And global capitalism is not only about growth. From time to time, including in our country, our economy is better, but at the same time, the gap between the rich and the poor also grow bigger. So yes, our life is better, but the gap between us, who are under the line and those who are above the line is also bigger. Now, in the election, both groups address the same thing, but by using different languages. Prabowo keep using the language of gap. Jokowi keep using the language of growth. Both are true, but they're speaking to different, to different target. So we will go back to this later. Please move on with. Now, Mas Philip mentioned earlier about the 2017 election in Jakarta, and one of the strong word that was used is about victimization of Islam. The question is, Indonesia is the largest Muslim country, and yet Muslims speak about marginalization and victimization of Islam. How does it make any sense? However, if we look across the globe, that actually also the language used by Donald Trump, the language used by the right-wing politician in Europe, also in Australia and New Zealand. So it's something that is not particularly Indonesian. And when we look at that, and therefore the language of gap is very effective for those who, bring up this language of victimization of Islam. And with that, they also then revive the goals of Jakarta Charter, because the discussion whether Islam should be part of the constitution, Islam should be part of Indonesian politics is not over. And from time to time we hear, people brought that back. In relation to that, we also remember that in the past, in 1980s until 70s and 80s, Suharto effectively depoliticized Islam, Islamic Party, Islamic group, and to make sure that the threat of political Islam can be get rid of. Now, in 1990s, however, we know that Suharto moved closer to Islam. Harold Jenkins, I believe, the Australian scholar who wrote Suharto and his general, wrote that, in 1977 election, Suharto invited prominent Christian leaders, and upon their arrival in his office, he said that our common enemy is Islam. That in 1977. And Suharto was very powerful during the time, and he was very close to Christian. But then in 1990s, when his military back is decreasing, and then he moved closer to Islam. Can we imagine what is being imagined by the Christian leader about what possibly Suharto told to Muslim leader, if in the 1977 he told them like that, right? And that's the reason why the tension among Muslim and Christian increased. And as we know that in the mid-1990s and soon after Suharto was forced down from power, the ethno-religious conflict erupted. Now, after Reformasi, we experienced what I call as the over-religionization of Islam. By over-religionization, I mean the use of religious symbol, especially Islamic symbol, in public sphere is very, very strong. I teach at UGM, and many of my students, when they want to give group presentation, they started with Assalamualaikum. This is not pengajian, religious Islamic gathering, and Muslim students also are part of the class. But why some students feel strongly to express their religious identity? And the other day, I was about to fly here to Jakarta in Jogja. It was Maghrib time, and all of a sudden, I heard the adhan was broadcasted to the waiting room in the airport. This is just little examples how public space is being religionized in the sense of Islamicized. And that is part of the consequences of, in the past, Islam was repressed, but then in 1990s, Islam was being the anak emas, the favorite ally. Now, after the Reformasi, therefore, Islamic group, saw the opportunity to express their political power by, articulating, religion in public space. Of course, because of the nature of capitalism, there's a gap. But how, and grievances, but how that gap is real and legitimate as a base for protest is different things. Now, the gap, the perceived gap, the perceived grievance and the objective grievance are not necessarily the same. In the past, we know that Islam suffers from numeric majority with minority mentality. That's a very popular term by Cak Nur. Today, that term is used again, although the situation is totally different, meaning that many people see the new reality by using the old perception. And to some degree, when this language is used, it works effectively in politics, including when, we listen to what happened to the Prabowo campaign in this election. Okay, so what happened to 212 movement, I believe, is, kind of perceived injustice. There is injustice in the country, but then that injustice is perceived in certain way and then translated into their, into collective experience among the people. It is interesting that most of the people who are involved in the protests many of them are middle class Muslim, whose economic status is not as worse as those who are on the lower class. However, they are more outspoken in criticizing the injustice, the marginalization of Islam, the victimization of Islam. Now, I want to raise this idea related to the introduction by Mas Philip, what I call as the abangan factor. When we saw the data from the election, we can sense where do you think is identity politics works most effectively? It works most effectively in Professor Mahfud MD used the wrong words as the hardliners provinces, and he created trouble. But it works very well there in West Java and in Sumatra and South Kalimantan and South Sulawesi. It works very well among the ethnic group whose identity, whose Islam is strong as their identity. But where does it work less effectively? I mentioned earlier the Javanese ethnic group consists of 40% of the population, and the political identity works less effectively in Central Java and in East Java. And when we go to West Java, it works among the Cirebonese and Indramayus, and in Lampung, also where many Javanese live, it works less effectively. So Javanese factor plays some role there, I believe. And even because of the big number of Javanese population, I would say that East and Central Java can be seen as the guardian of inclusive indigenized Islam. Most Muslim footed for Prabowo. I don't mean to say that many of them are like hardliners or radicals or something like that. But I would say that many of the Muslims, are entrapped by identity politics. However, Javanese Muslim, in comparison to other, they are less entrapped by identity politics. And I think Abangan not in the definition given by Gertz, but Abangan in the sense that, it's a kind of value, it's kind of worldview, a productive dialogue between Islam and local culture. So I think by rethinking about the definition of Abangan, a friendly encounter and dialogue between faith and local culture, I think is one way to solve the problem of identity politics and polarization in the society. With that, I end my presentation, and I welcome any comment or question later. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Ahmad Monjit. I saw some sparks in the eyes in the audience. I think they already have questions and ideas about what Pak Monjit have been saying. Later on will be translated into questions. Now I'd like to invite the third speaker. In the line, we have Ibu Nafa. Please, the 10 minutes is yours.
Thank you, Pak Philip. Good afternoon and Assalamualaikum, because why not? Well, it's really nice to be here. Maybe I'm the only non-Fulbright alumni in the panel, so thank you. And I'm going to talk about the Islamist agenda beyond 2019. When I say Islamist, I just specifically focus on the Islamist civil society groups that made up the 212 movement and not so much on the political parties. Okay, I'll start by showing you this image. So the Reuni Akbar, there were hundreds of thousands of people, whereas I expected that there would be an immediate demo right on the election day, but it turns out that it was on Kertanegara, it was not that many people, 1,000, 2,000 top. And the people there were mostly just Prabowo's diehards. They don't even look like the crowd in the 212. So, well, some of the leaders, the ustad, were there, but the audience was, they even looked different. And so where are the others? Just business as usual. Ustad Bahtiar Nasir, for example, just 2 days, he's running a lot of programs in his Islamic center. Like seminars on how to go to heaven. You pay 5 million for VIP. I don't know VIP here or in the heaven. But Ustad Felix Xiao, for example, is still doing his tour, traveling stuff in Turkey. So they look very calm. Then I was just baffled. Where are they? I thought they would be, ready right away because of all the narratives about fraud. And don't forget that next Monday, it's Ramadan already, and that's the peak of Islamic commodification, so we don't expect any demo, at least not yet. So why is this so-called people power unlikely, at least at the moment? First, I think it's the turnout at this, the demo in the past week, for example, in front of Bawaslu, it's been really, really small, partly because it's a different mission than the 212. The 212 was framed as a moral force against evil, whereas right now it's just, plain power politics, which maybe are not very appealing to some segments of the 212 crowd. And so since they couldn't mobilize that many people, then there was this kind of meme on social media that no, it's actually deliberate. We didn't try to mobilize. They actually, for example, some FPI leaders told people don't get provoked, jangan terprovokasi, don't fall into the government trap. They want us to, create chaos, go into the street, but we won't do that. Is that just a face-saving narrative because they're embarrassed with the turnout of the demo? But I think it's more than that. It's also their attempt, for example, the Ijtima Ulama yesterday, it was an effort to buy time and also to establish legitimacy. Because if they have some sort of fatwa as the basis, and they can frame it as a moral struggle, then and also they can prepare the resources. I mean, you can't just mobilize a massive demo overnight. You need time, build resources, networks, and everything. But it doesn't mean that mass protests are out of the table. For some factions of the 212 Alliance, actually, they're more eager than others to do this people power movement. So what are the factions? I'll just go quickly. So what we call the 212 movement, the coordinators, the organizers actually consist of various Islamic movements. But I'll just focus on three, the Salafi and Modernist, the FPI and HTI. Now, what I call the Salafi is not the quietist Salafi, but the activist Salafi. Some of them, yes, graduated from Saudi Arabia, but they're mostly locally funded. And their constituency are mainly middle-class Muslims. They've got extensive school networks, business, all these clothing, books, whatever. They have these business networks, and they're more concerned with high politics as opposed to practical politics or what they call dirty politics. But on elections, for example, groups like Wahda Islamiyah that is led by Zaitun Rasmin is included in this category. Bahtiar Nasir is also in this category, and also other modernists who are affiliated with maybe Muhammadiyah and maybe Dewan Dakwah. But what makes them different from FPI is that first they're more economically well off, and they focus on this high politics. Even though in election they would support certain candidates, but they don't want to be beholden to these political elites. They want to be equal or even act as the advisors of these politicians. Whereas FPI is theologically it's Sunni traditionalist, closer to NU, but mostly led by Hadrami like Habib Rizik, and non-NU traditionalists. Some of them are ex-Mashumi, for example, and their main followers are the urban poor, so different from the Salafi crowd. And so they're interested in making money, gaining income, for example, through what Ian Wilson calls morality racketeering, and also as civilian auxiliary. So they work with the police, for example, to protect when a demonstration to be peaceful, so it doesn't go violent. Whereas Hizb ut-Tahrir is, as you know, it's part of the transnational movement. It has a very strong base at universities, started in 1980s. And their focus, they're really anti-democracy. So for all the noise that they made during the election campaign about, Jokowi's PK and everything, many of Hizb ut-Tahrir people actually didn't vote. So these people, despite their theological differences, their tactical and personal rivalries, as you know that, for example, the chief of GNP FMUI, Bahtiar Nasir, was fired and replaced by an FPI guy. So there was all these personal rivalries, but it was papered over by their desire to defeat Ahok and then Jokowi. But it's really likely that more disagreement and splintering will happen again. But let's say that they all agree to go through the legal formal channels, like what the Ijtima Ulama said. And go to MK, appeal, and then accept whatever MK's decision is. In that, even in that ideal world, is the movement going to be over? No, because this is not the end game for them. They have a very long-term agenda. So, for example, if you see the posting of Felix Xiao on the day of the election after seeing the quick count result, he said this is not a defeat because. Look how far we've come, in 10 years ago, the da'wah isn't this strong, but now it's very strong. And so this is what we call a mini victory before the real victory. So what's their long-term agenda? Is it a global caliphate? Yes, maybe for Hizb ut-Tahrir, but they also know that it's too utopian. So, and they're not that, they're also intellectual, you know, they think about these things. Is it an Islamic state in Indonesia? Well, yes, but maybe not another Darul Islam, you know, not through violent means. So this new segment of Islamic revival is what we see in not just in urban areas, but also in other parts of Indonesia, as we see the result of exit polls. Most of the Prabowo voters, for example, are younger people, and other surveys also show that younger people tend to be more conservative. So this is the new generation of Islamic revivalism. They want to have it all. They want piety, they want moral order, but they also want upward mobility. So they don't want any chaos that could disrupt their lifestyle, for example, and their business prospect, for example. And so that's why they prefer for a slow-paced white revolution. Ideologically, they're very fluid. You cannot put them in certain category. You know, they follow Ustad Somad, who is traditionalist, but they also like Ustad Adhi Hidayat, who is from Muhammadiyah, and maybe closer to Salafi. So what they want really is a bottom-up Islamization, not top-down. And it all starts from kindergarten. Kindergarten is a huge thing, as you all know. But what we'll see, I think, at least in the immediate future, is the convergence of Islamic revivalism and ultranationalism. So this is, I think what's likely that we see is Islamist majoritarianism. Not a full-blown Islamic state like in Syria or nothing like that, but what's more likely in the Indonesian context is majoritarianism. This is where members of the majority faith and culture are viewed as the nation's true citizens. The others, the minority, are just numpang. They're just guest citizens. So the statements of the 212 leaders actually suggest that. For example, one leader said, we don't want Islamic state, we don't want to change. We also accept NKRI, but my NKRI is better than yours. Why? Another person said, because in our NKRI, 90% of the population also have 90% of jobs and positions. And then another leader said, Islam accepts democracy, but the question is, does democracy accept Islam? So this is different, very different from the violent jihadists. They don't cross over. And so I don't agree if some people say, conservatism or intolerance is a precursor to violent extremism, for example. I don't agree with that statement, because they really disagree on the methods and what kind of Islamic state that they imagine. So what's the majoritarian issues? In practical terms, first I think it's the Pancasila and Islam. As Pak Munjid said, there's the ghost of the Jakarta Charter. But I think only FPI now wants to restore the Jakarta Charter. The others, they don't necessarily, it's too hard, we've tried twice in the parliament to change back to Jakarta Charter, but it didn't work out. So the easy thing is to reinterpret Pancasila in light of Islamic values. What kind of Islamic values? Well, their own interpretations. So they want to turn the table by saying that Islamists are the true nationalists. If you're anti-Islam, then you're against the majority, then you're not nationalist. And then they want to defend orthodoxy, Sunni orthodoxy, so we're likely to see more, blasphemy cases, for example. But now the question is whose version? Because the leaders of 212 also come from different theological backgrounds. Is it the Salafi version of orthodoxy? Is this Habib Rizik's version? And then the third one is, I don't think Perda Syariah would be that much of an issue anymore. I mean, the existing Perda Syariah have not been really enforced. And so what they want is to incorporate Islamic moral values in national law, in laws that seem to be secular, like the sexual violence law, for example, like the marriage law, for example, that seem like secular issues, but that have bigger impact in people's life. So. And if you're interested in our reports, there you go. Thank you.
Thank you, Nafa. I think that's a very kind of a persuasive approach to this question about the agenda of the Islamist group in Indonesia. Now, I'd like to invite Okta of CSIS. The 10 minutes is yours.
Thank you, Bung Philips. First and foremost, I have to say thank you again to Fulbright for a very generous scholarship that allowed me to study in the state. I studied in 2014 to 2016, and I think without that scholarship, I'm not going to be allowed to sit here on the stage. So thank you again. I'm gonna be talking about the thing that already been touched upon briefly by previous speakers about polarization in Indonesia. But I think I wanna challenge a little bit about our common understanding about polarization in Indonesia by asking what do we exactly mean by saying that polarization has been on the rise in Indonesia these days, and also to the extent that polarization really prevails in Indonesia. Does that have to do with regional factors or regional locations? That is to say, does regional factors actually influence more our, seemingly polarizations in our country than, let's say, religious issue? Because when we talk about polarization, sometimes we refer to religious polarization, actually. So, please, next slide. No, yes, what is polarization? So in a political science terms, the concept of polarization sometimes refers to the cases in which one views or one stands on a number of issues such as policies or political parties is greatly driven by his or her affiliation with particular ideologies or political parties. So in the US, for instance, if you are a Republican or if you are a Democrat, you're a liberal or you're a conservative, then you're going to have a very different opinion on a number of issues such as foreign policies, economy, domestic politics, and so on and so forth. And in Indonesia context, as Philips already mentioned at the beginning, 2016 and 2017, we have a very polarizing elections, smear campaign at the time. So whether you are the supporters of Ahok or you are the supporters of Anies, you're going to have a very different political opinion, very different opinion on elections, on politics, and maybe beyond that as well. And according to many research, polarization is bad for democracy because it actually hampers people to cooperate each other. And then people can get easily suspicious with each other, and then that makes democracy hard to work out because in some ways democracy requires cooperation among people in particular countries. So that's going to be very bad for people because if you don't cooperate, then what you can find is just gridlock, political deadlock, and things like that. Now, next. If Indonesia has been really polarizing in recent years, I want to ask, has it been really translated into votes in the presidential election that we just had these days? And if yes, how do we know? And then we also know that between the two candidates, Jokowi and Prabowo, Prabowo was the one who thought to be representative of Islamic groups. And then I want to ask, does votes from Islamic groups tend to be given to Prabowo instead of Pak Jokowi, right? And then the problem with proving whether or not the votes for Islamic groups will go to Prabowo is that how do you measure that? And one of the most common ways of doing it is actually by, and the easiest one is by a survey, so asking people about their religious affiliations. So for instance, if you are the members or sympathizers of FPI, HTI, you might tend to vote for Prabowo instead of Pak Jokowi. Then if you are the members of PKS, for instance, or sympathizers of PKS, you're going to vote for him instead of Pak Jokowi. But I think this kind of proxy is quite problematic because it tends to just validating people's religious affiliations. So I think it would be better if we have a more neutral parameter, and that is to say, in this regard, I use the number of mosques across Indonesia. So the hypothesis would be the area or districts in this presentation with higher mosque densities, meaning that more mosques relative to the number of populations in particular districts, will tend to vote for Prabowo. That's the hypothesis, right? Because we believe that those Islamic group will tend to vote for Prabowo instead of Pak Jokowi. And then next slide. And here's here's what I did in a very short exercise. So I used data from Indo Dapur World Bank to get a total population at district level. The last data was in 2015. Then I extrapolate that into 2017 because the data of the total number of mosques at Kabupaten, Kota was in 2017. So I need to extrapolate that. And then the data of the number of mosques was in the sub-district or in kecamatan, and then I add up into total number of mosques at the Kabupaten Kota. And then I'm gonna see what I call mosque density. And then I also use the data from Kawal Pemilu, the final results of the 2014 elections when the two first met. And then the ongoing results of KPU, right? As we know that the manual counting is still undergoing right now, but I think the last one we have more than 60% already counted manually by KPU, and then the last one I use data wrapper.de for geotagging the map. Next slide. This is the map of the Indonesian population at district level in 2017. It's not really telling here, just next, mas. And then this is the mosque distribution in Indonesia at district level. So obviously in Java, in which you have millions of populations, it's gonna have more mosques than other areas in Indonesia. And then in the eastern part of Indonesia and then the northern part of Kalimantan island, you see they have less mosques than other areas in Indonesia. But next slide. Just relying on the number of mosques, I think will not fair enough, because obviously provinces with higher population size like Java, right? West Java, East Java, and Central Java will tend to have a more mosques than other provinces, like in my hometown in Jambi, for instance. So I use this mosque density. So you calculate the total number of mosques in particular district. Sorry, total population in particular district, and then you divided it with the total number of mosques in those districts. And then in this graph, I remove Papua because Papua was an extreme outlier here, because the graph will be all the way to the right if I put Papua in there. So you see the least mosques in Indonesia was provinces in which Muslims were minorities. So in Papua Barat and then in Bali, then you can see also in Kalimantan Utara, in Sulawesi Utara. So those are outliers, and then the rest are just normal distributions here. Okay, next slide. I think just, yeah. Okay, there you go. So I wanted to know whether the higher mosque density districts in Indonesia will tend to vote for Prabowo or not. That's to test our hypothesis. And then if you look at these numbers, in the first one, you see that districts with higher mosque density, so one mosque less than 400 people in particular district, it turns out that they tend to vote to Pak Jokowi instead of to Pak Prabowo. And then across the board, if you the next graph, districts with a less mosque density will also vote for Pak Jokowi. And this is very interesting. I can show you the next graphs, the next map, that this will actually impact our seemingly polarizations that we understand. Because I think if I look at the the map, if I look at to the map, just next slide, lagi. Yeah. So Jokowi versus Prabowo in 2019 at district level. So you see the red color is for Pak Jokowi and then the blue color is for Pak Prabowo. I'm sorry if the font is just too small. I use free stuff here. You see, it's a very polarizing in terms of regional differences. So Pak Jokowi wins clearly in Kalimantan and also in Java. It's mostly in West Java and then also in East Java and also in the Papua. The gray color means that the manual counting are not finished yet in those districts. Whereas Prabowo clearly wins in Sumatra Island. But you see, Jokowi can take some districts in the outer area of Pulau Sumatra, in which many non-Muslims populations reside there. And then if you compare to the next slide, this is the result of 2014 elections. So in 2014, Jokowi wins across the board in all islands in Indonesia. Even he leads Prabowo in Pulau Sumatra. But in 2019, it's very contrasting, results that we see, in which Prabowo turns out to take many of the districts in Sumatra. So I think that's quite interesting to see these findings. Slide sebelumnya. Lagi. Yes. No. This one. Now, if you look at the number of vote comparisons between regions, so total number of districts in every pulau in Indonesia, I count that. So one interesting finding is that to see, despite Prabowo wins more districts in 2019, but he ended up having less votes on average, actually, compared to 2014. So winning more regions for him doesn't mean that he gained more votes. Because if you remember, in 2014, Prabowo lost to Jokowi with 5 to 6% of margin in 2014. But in 2019, according to CSIS quick count, he lost to 11.2% to Pak Jokowi. So it could be because the total votes that Pak Jokowi win in Central and East Java can compensate, his loss in many other districts in Pulau Sumatra. And also, if you look at the 2014 results, Jokowi won in all regions in Indonesia, so in Jawa, Sumatra, Kalimantan, Sulawesi to Bali, and lain-lain means NTT, Maluku, and Maluku Utara. He won in those areas, but in 2019, he lost to Prabowo in Sumatra, obviously, and then he also lost slightly in Pulau Sulawesi. So looking at these results and also to this map, sometimes I wonder what do we exactly mean by saying that, okay, we are having polarization these days in Indonesia, but I remember Edward Aspinall just wrote a piece in the New Mandala that challenged actually the common notions of these polarizations by saying that what's actually happening in Indonesia right now is what you already mentioned at the beginning, Mas Philips. There is the return of ideological competitions that already there in Indonesia in 1950s, right? Because at that time, you have Masyumi, the dominant party in Pulau Sumatra, and then you have NU, and then some other Islamic political parties in in Java Island, and then that kind of differences between the two regions, he said it's remain true for Indonesian politics, given the results of the presidential elections of 2019. I think I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Okta. That complements the the qualitative accounts of the state and politics in Indonesia. Ibu Perludem, Titi Anggraini, the 10 minutes is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Uda Philips. Actually, I'm from Sumatra, like Uda Philips, so we share the same feelings, yeah, Uda. Thank you, CSIS and Aminef, Fulbright, and USINDO for inviting me. I'm Titi Anggraini from Perludem, a local NGO based in Jakarta, Association for Election and Democracy. I will talk especially from the election context, from the legal framework. I won't touch the issue of identity politics from the political perspective, like Pak Munjid, Mbak Nafa, and Mas Nuri. Well, firstly, I would like to start by saying that in the midst of a very tight competition and also a very difficult technical complexity challenge, the 2019 election runs peacefully and is full of voter enthusiasms. Even in my polling station, I arrived at 7:30 and got the antrian tickets, and I already got the numbers of 43. It's never happened in my polling station before. The voter turnout always below 60%. But in last election, the voter turnout in my polling station more than 80%, 83% for the first time in election history in my complex. Gitu. So I think we have to appreciate what we achieve on the voting day in April 17. Okay, the 2019 election, we are the third largest democracy in the world after India and the United States. But from the elections, the voting day, we are the biggest one-day election in the world. We run the biggest one-day election in the world with 5 ballot papers and more than 190 million voters. We also run the most complex election in the world. We don't have to be proud of this, but it's not easy to run the most complex election in the world peacefully. We are also the largest democratic Muslim country in the world. And talking about 2019 election as the background for the legal framework, we use law number 7, year 2017. That regulates all the provision on the contestation, how we manage the election stages, and so on and so on. As for your information, this law number 7, 2017, enacted by President, signed by President Jokowi only one day before we officially started the election stages. So President Jokowi signed the law August 16, one day before the Independence Day, 2017, and KPU officially announced the election stages to start the election stages for 2019 election on August 17. So can you imagine that our election organizers must run the most complex election with a very, tight time to prepare all the things. 2019 election is the most phenomenal, historical, and experimental election for us in Indonesia. This is the most competitive and complex election. Why? Conducted simultaneously, same day, same time, same polling station. We have more than 813,000 polling stations all across Indonesia. 5 ballot papers, except in Jakarta, only 5 ballots, with open list system for DPR and DPRD. So in last election, we have almost 8,000 DPR candidates and almost 300,000 legislative candidates for DPR and DPRD. It's not a small election. And also it's a competitive election because for the first time, we increased the parliamentary threshold rate from 3.5% to 4% parliamentary threshold. So based on the survey or the quick count conducted by Uda Phillips and the gang, only 9 political parties can get seats in the parliament. And also it's competitive because we have 16 political parties plus 4 local political parties in Aceh. Can you imagine that we have 4% of parliamentary thresholds, and at the same time, the number of political parties increase from 12 political parties in 2014 election into 16 national political parties in 2019. They must gain seats in parliament with high numbers of parliamentary threshold, but more competitors from the election contestant. And also one of the factors why we have polarization, well, Pak Munjid, I think beside the factors and the reasons already mentioned by Pak Munjid and Nuri and Mbak Nafa, but I think the polarization also conducted unnaturally, because the polarization also forced by the election system by implementing the presidential threshold, presidential nomination threshold. In our election law, it's stipulated that if political party or coalition of political party wants to nominate presidential candidate, they must have 20% of seats and 25% or 25% of valid votes that resulted from the last election. It is the only provision in the world like this. By having the presidential threshold, it's like a political party must have a kawin paksa, forced to being married, yeah. It's not natural. The coalition formed by the political party is not a natural coalition. So that's why from 2014 and 2019 we have the same presidential candidates. Dia lagi. We have more than 250 million population. We have 16 political parties. We have more than 190 million voters, but only dia lagi candidates. And well, it is not easy to build a presidential nomination coalition with a different ideology of political parties. So in my opinion, why we have a polarization like now, one of the factor is because the legislator forced to implement the presidential threshold provision in our presidential nominations. And also limited and lack of information access to the legislative candidates make religion become one of the consideration for voters to cast their votes. But unfortunately, because they have limited access on the legislative election candidates, they receive information from their close person or their family members that force them to cast their vote based on the religion aspect. And unfortunately, the politicization of religion also combined with the hoax and disinformation. For instance, you heard that in Karawang that there's a hoax disseminated by young lady that if Jokowi win, so Jokowi will legalize LGBT. So I think the competitive election and limited and lack of information access to the legislative election also one of the factor why we have a politicization of religion that also combined with disinformation and misinformation. I think for the next what we should do, we must comprehensively evaluate our election law and then revoke the presidential threshold. And I went to the Constitutional Court 2 times to revoke the provision on presidential threshold. I gained success, aka successfully rejected by Constitutional Court twice. But I won't stop. I think we have to continue the electoral reform in Indonesia by having more, flexible provision on the presidential nomination. So Indonesian people can have more options, more choices on the presidential candidates, not like now dia lagi. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Titi. Now, because we started late, so I think we have until 3:15, so it's going to be like 15 minutes behind the schedule. It's been interesting to listen to all the speakers, but I think the ideas are not conclusive. Even I've seen some differences. For example, Pak Munjid and Pak Ron kind of saying that there is some sort of division or divided after the election, but Okta said that it's actually not as bad as we thought. He's using his own measure, that is the density of mosque, which is, I think, a very interesting measure that I think we can explore more after this. And secondly, to Ibu Nafa, maybe she is saying that the agenda of the Islamists is more subtle. It's more no longer violent, using violent means to achieve the goals and so on. So in a way, they are becoming moderate in their efforts. They're different from ISIS. So in a way, it's kind of they're adopting new strategies and so on, which is more difficult to tackle, I think, because that's more subtle and more cultural and so on. Now, with that in mind, I'd like to open the floor for a few questions. For the first round, I'd like to invite 2 or 3. One in the front, the other at the back, the very back, and then another one, Bapak with the checkered shirt, baju kotak-kotak, abu-abu. We can open the next round later on. Please be brief so you can give other participants to ask questions as well. Yes, Pak, please. Please be brief.
Thank you. It's a very important and meaningful, good information that you shared all. But I would like to first touch on Ms. Nava, who gave us the very good point about what is the next agenda of Islamic. I believe the Islamic is not one single vote or one single identity. I believe that. And even about this topic, politics and religion, it's not something new actually. I think even from Rome Republic, religion and politics has been mingled each other. So what happened today is nothing new. What is new, as put by Mr. Nurai, is the more effective use of mosque as a campaign field rather than the rally. You know, I think this is something that I learned from this year election, that more mosque has been used for political purpose rather than as a place for worship. What I know now today, more ustads that against the presidents or against Jokowi is more popular, more acceptable by the most Muslim. I think this is something new that I need you further to elaborate. Whether it is true that the majority of mosques now being used as a political campaign venue rather than a worship place. Thank you.
Thank you. Next one, the one at the very back. Yes. With the hat, with the glasses. Please introduce yourself as well.
Okay, thank you for the time. My name is Ivan. I just want to share my opinions because the title is Politics and Religion in Indonesia. There are many kinds of politics and there are many religions in Indonesia. And all I hear is all about Islam. What about other religion? The first and the second is Pancasila is not religious enough? Are people of Indonesia not well educated or not educated well? And I think it's kind of some agenda with Divide et Impera. It's fighting each other. That Indonesia will chaos and easy to take over. What about that? There's another opinion of me. But there are some of hoax news, hoax contribution in this election about many hoax is sharing by many people. What about that? Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Last one.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I would like to ask Mr. Doctor that your presentation revealed that 97% of minority in Indonesia, religious minority in Indonesia, vote for President Jokowi. Is it have a kind of factor like Islamophobia, as we say that Mr. Nur is finding about the geographically in East and Central Java, Jokowi have decisively win the election, which is we know that those two provincial is a moderate Islam moderate Islam stronghold, which is they are truly against the kind of like narration like that TKN said that we will if Prabowo won that if Prabowo win that we will go to like in Syria, something like that, Islamophobia like that. Is it have influence with the 97% of minority religious and the win of Jokowi in East and Central Java? Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I think we have one question to Okta about your measure and the mosque density and whether or not mosque actually has been used, in the campaign. And then we have question to Pak Munjid, the last one, and to Ibu Nafa as well. But in general, there are questions. Last one being, is Pancasila enough for us, to deal with all these questions about religion and the states? Okta, please start. Please also be brief.
Yes, thank you for the questions. So whether or not mosque is being used for the campaign, yeah, I mean, in my presentations, if it says that mosque or many mosques are being used for the campaign, then I said at the beginning that the vote, with districts with higher mosque density should have gone to Prabowo instead of Jokowi. But the results shows the opposite, right? Districts or kabupaten kota with higher mosque density tend to vote for Jokowi more than Prabowo. The question is why? I just can speculate on that. Maybe is to the extent that mosque is being used, I think it's a very confined to some provinces in Indonesia. Maybe in Jakarta or in West Java, the two provinces that became stronghold for Jokowi, many mosques will become politicized, right? But when you go to other areas, other provinces in Indonesia, that's really, I think, not the case, because you see the result, right? Jokowi wins in the districts with higher mosque density, and he also wins in a district with lower or less mosque density. So it means that the politicizations of agama, the masjid, it's actually on average not really effective to sway voters for Prabowo. That's the way I see my results.
Thank you. Pak Munjid?
Okay, thank you. First of all, I want to respond to Mas Nuri. How did you come to that conclusion? Actually, we are curious. Because Central Java and East Java, voted for Jokowi. And of course, there are many mosques there. And because the population is very, very dense. If you make average, and as you know, that Javanese population is 40% of the total population. So if you make average based on the total number of all the mosques divided into the population, then probably it works because Jokowi won in Central Java and East Java. But that's just brief response to you. I don't know how did you come to the conclusion. Okay, for the question for me, the number that I use is not mine. 97% non-Muslim voted for Jokowi is provided by many institutions, indicator politic and others. So it is up to us on how to interpret what the number means. And I didn't say that it means Islamophobia. It means, for me, that non-Muslim saw more hope in Jokowi in relation to the policies and others probably. And exactly because many of the hardliners flock around Prabowo. Clearly, Prabowo is not an ideal figure for Muslim voters in many sense. However, because of his move, I don't want to say his policy, his move, he can be at least temporary alliance for this Islamists. I don't even, I can't imagine if Prabowo really won, what's going to happen to the Islamists. Because, there's so many, factions within that circle. So probably the situation can be worse than if they lost. Thank God they lost. But again, the number is not mine. And I think there are many interpretations that we can make why 97% of the voters voted for Jokowi without necessarily understood as Islamophobia. I would say that the hope for maintaining Indonesia as imagined by most of the people is more reasonable under Jokowi. Of course, we have so many problems with Jokowi, but in that case, I think it makes some sense. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just address the question of where are the other religions. So I think once one group asks for some kind of majoritarianism, that it's going to be like an epidemic, Here you have Perda Syariah, in Manokwari you have Perda Injil, and then a group of government officials from Manokwari did a comparative study in Aceh about the implementation of Perda Syariah, so they can do the same in Manokwari, except it's the opposite. So it's not a good trend at all. Whether it's done by the Muslim groups, the Christian groups, the Hindu groups in Bali. Now, if everyone turns to be like FPI, then we're in big trouble. But on the one hand, we have to, what we want is the equality, a constitutional guarantee of equality of all citizens, regardless of their ethnicity and religion. But on the other hand, we also have to acknowledge the underlying factors behind why is this, the minority mentality of the majority population. Because of, partly it's because of the socio-economic inequality. That's why this narrative of, we have to defend the majority, not the minority, because the minority is already strong. They said minority is not in terms of numbers or quantity, but the control over economy, for example. So it's based on legitimate grievances. And if there is, one positive impact of the 212 movement is that it forced Jokowi to focus more on equality, socio-economic inequality. Now the next one is Pancasila enough? Well, obviously it's not. Now everyone can say, I'm Pancasila, I'm nationalist, but what does that mean? How do you operationalize Pancasila? As Pak Natsir said, Pancasila is like an empty room, you can fill it with whatever you want. So that's how to operationalize Pancasila, for example. If some religious groups, they have indoctrination program from, kindergarten level up to, the adult, the grown-up level. So how do you operationalize Pancasila in that matter? And is one's interpretation of Pancasila is better than the others on what basis? So I think this is, this is a long-term problem, socioeconomic inequality, interpretation of Pancasila. It's not something that we can solve in the short term, but I'm still optimistic. Thank you.
Ron, you would like to respond to any question?
All right, thank you. So it's interesting that it was taken, my comments were saying there is polarization when I was saying I don't think there is, and I agree with your assessment that what appeared to be polarization was disunified groups allying behind two candidates because there were only two candidates. If there were 3 candidates or 4 candidates, then we wouldn't have what looked like polarization wouldn't have taken place. As to far as is Pancasila enough? Reciting Pancasila is not enough. Living Pancasila would be enough. How do you operationalize it? Well, okay, I'm doing research on GP Ansar Bansar. Being willing to give up your life for someone of another faith is living Pancasila. That would be enough. My other question, when you think about it, and I do this at many meetings, who in the room has had lunch this last week, 7 days, with somebody of another religion? Okay, this is an unusual room, but it looks like we only hit about 30%. Go to many places, go to Muhammadiyah campuses, go to two people, out of people out of a room this size. But again, we still had about 60% no. I mean, you can only hate somebody of another, people of another religion if you know no one of that other religion. If you regularly gather, break bread with people of another ethnic group, another religion, another whatever, you're not going to fall into the rhetoric of, oh, they're evil. Because you're like, well, maybe as a whole, but not, So you're like, well, Joe isn't evil, Ahmed isn't evil, So, I don't think so. So, thank you.
Thank you. Didi, you would like to respond to any? No? All right. We have... No, you have given one chance. I'll give to another... I'll after this round, okay? So I give the opportunity to others. Ibu, Didi, and Bapak, and then the person in the front. Please.
Okay. First of all, thank you for all the panelists. Many of them are actually my friends. I just want to raise something that's missing from this discussion is actually about the experience of women, the gender issues that unfortunately no one in the panel are actually talking about how gender plays between politics and also religion. And I believe that because women are 50% of the votes, so I think there are some kind of difference about how religious narrative is actually have been built to attract men votes and also women votes. So for example, because I'm working in the Human Rights Commission, that we see that actually the bill of anti-sexual violence have been used by certain political parties to attack certain political parties as well. So for example, that these anti-sexual bills that endorsed by the government is actually want to legalize LGBT and also pro-adultery, something like that. And they put a finger on certain political parties that they say that those parties is actually agree for the anti-sexual bills. So I was just curious about that. So from your observation, how actually the narrative, gender narrative that actually also play a lot to attract women votes. That's number one. And the second is I would like to push the discussion beyond the election, especially about Nafa say about the Islamization of public life and also the religion. For me personally, I really concerned about this issue because now all those let's say conservative groups is actually they also use the legal ways, the democratic ways to instill their political agenda. So, for example, through KUHP, through many revision of the legislation that actually now are discussing in the parliament and also in the local level. That of course now they don't use Perda Syariah, they use more on the like public order regulation, but inside those local regulation is actually imposing certain standard of morality and also certain standard of religious value. Thank you.
Thank you. Silakan Pak.
Thank you. My name is Bambang Sudewo. First, I'd like to thank you all the presenters for very informative presentations. My first question is for Mbak Nafa. I would like to know more about this, what you call Islamist majoritarianism. What will they treat, how they will treat this, those who have the status as guests in this majoritarianism, especially their rights in practicing their religion or their social, civil rights, and how they will treat the Muslim, but not as peers as HTI, for example, the so-called Muslim Abangan, or now they call Posmo-Muslim. My second question is for Pak Munjid. How do you connect this indigenous or indigenized Muslim with NU? Because lately, or especially recently, NU is, I was confused when Pak Agil Sirat says that Pak Mahmud MD is not NU kader. So how do you relate indigenized Muslim with NU now? Are they the same or they differ? How they differ? Thank you.
Thank you. Last one, please. No.
Thank you. A quick one from me. I'm Wahyudi from the Straits Times. I would like to get some views from the experts here, whether we are seeing a rise of Islamism now, how bad is it, and come election 2024, would we have higher chance of seeing a leader from the conservative group, from the Salafi, win the election next time round? And would also like to get your views on how the government can do to effectively curb the rise of Islamism that they haven't done or that they are doing, which you think are not enough. Thank you.
Thank you. So first one is an open question to all about the gender issues in the election. Who wants to tackle that? Titi? All right.
Thank you, Mbak Riri, for remind us to talk about a very important topics about women, religion and politics. Well, actually, Mbak Riri, based on my observation, women issues still artificial issue for both for the candidates. Women more fanatic and more militant for 2019 election as voters and as campaigner. But if we read the vision and mission of the candidates, they don't talk much about what their agenda for women. They created politik emak-emak and then woman wings within the two team, but they don't talk much woman as an actor, as a subject, but more than as an object. And I agree with you that issues on undang-undang penghapusan kekerasan seksual used by some of the politicians, even in our dapil, because we are from the same electorates, Tangerang Selatan, to attack other political parties. That the political party try to promote to legalize the LGBT and so on and so on. But I think we have to taking into account and take it seriously for our advocacy agenda after we know the names of the elected MPs, because I think there's no new names, mostly the incumbent re-elected. It means we will fight with the same groups in parliament. So I agree with you, it's like an alarm for us. Women become important as an object, but not as a subject. The agenda more to gain their votes, but not to make them as an political actors or political subject in our election arena. Yeah.
Thank you. Bu Nafa, there are questions directed to you.
What's this majoritarianism gonna look like? Look no further to Yudhoyono's era. I mean, all of this, the SKB on tempat ibadah, all the rules that how SPY accommodated the conservative within government institutions, not just MUI. So that's a taste of, what they want. But on the other hand, I would just point you to the article written by Markus Mitzner, Mas Burhan, and Mbak Rizka on the it's based on a survey of intolerance in the past 10 years, and it shows that first the level of intolerance hasn't increased. It's just the demography change. It's now the better educated and the more well-off people are likely to be conservative or intolerant. But on the other hand, there's a rise of political intolerance rather than cultural intolerance. So cultural intolerance is like building churches in the neighborhood, something like that. And we know that the Tuan-Tu leaders paid lip service to tolerance. They said, no, we don't have problem with minority. We protect their rights. But we don't want them to, but they also have to tahu diri, tahu tempatnya. It's their kind of party line on the issue of tolerance. So it's okay, but don't go beyond your private space. So in public life, the privilege would be for whatever the majority is. If in Java it's the Muslims, in Papua it's the Christians, and that's why I'm really worried about. And so it's what we're likely to see, as Pak Philip said, maybe these Islamist groups have moderated, or is it that the definition of moderation has shifted to the right?
Thank you. Pak Munjid.
Okay. Is indigenous Islam the same or difference with NU? Okay. I would not say the same, because if I said the same, then only NU is the version of indigenized religion. Indigenous Islam, sorry. Because we see in, in South Sulawesi, in Central Sulawesi, the kind of Islam that is practiced by the Muslim there is also indigenized Islam. In West Sumatra, we have kaum muda and kaum tua, and kaum tua is a form of indigenized Islam. So it's not the same with NU. However, I would say yes, NU is a form of indigenized Islam, which is therefore different from Puritan Islam, in the sense that Islam should be purified from anything that considered as non-Islamic aspect, including local culture. Because indigenized Islam see local culture as a dialogue partner. And therefore, being Javanese, being Minang, being Bugis and others, is not antithetical to being Muslim and also being Indonesian at the same time. Well, the question about why Pak Mahfud was considered not necessarily as NU is more of political, situation. So of course, he's Maduris, and people say that 99% of Maduris are NU. The rest are probably Muhammadiyah It's a joke. But yes, Professor Mahmood was NU by birth, by blood, and some other become NU by research like Pak Ronald. Okay, the second question, are we witnessing the rise of Islamic conservatism? I would say we are witnessing the rise of Islamic formalism, and they are different. You know, why? The more interesting question for me is why. If that is the case, why? I would say we are experiencing the changing of landscape of Muslim since 1990s. You know, among the others, because of the New Order project of modernization, public school, public health, and others, then because Muslims are the majority, they enjoyed, benefit the project of modernization. More Muslims eventually in 1990s enter public universities. However, most of these Muslims are not necessarily people coming from very well trained, Islam. And many of them only got Islamic education at public school, which is very, very superficial. However, because of the New Order politicization of religion, including Islam, then their religion became very political. Remember that in 1965, everybody should be associated with one particular religion. If not, they can be accused of being communist, and that's very serious. And therefore, being religious means to demonstrate their religious identity. I am part of this group, I am part of that group, and that is very political. And therefore, formalism became very important. In the past, pious religious people tend not to demonstrate their piety. But today, even if you're not pious, you're supposed to demonstrate your piety. That is very political. And therefore, that's very formalistic. And therefore, it's very good for political commodity. It's very good for economic commodity. And the business person enjoy that. So I think we are witnessing the rise of Islamic formalism that can be easily twisted for economic purpose and for political purpose. How the government should take care of that, I have no idea. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Munjid. Pak Ron, please. NU by research.
Ya, NKRI harga mati. Whether I don't know if in 2024 a Salafi president is possible, although as I mentioned to you at lunch, if that candidate seems strong, I don't pray, but I think I'll start praying for it not to happen. You know, oftentimes we do talk about tolerance. Tolerance is not enough. I mean, so your child brings a boyfriend or a girlfriend home. Mom, Dad, we want to get married. I tolerate him so much. No. You want love, cherish, listen to, value, protect. That can be done between communities in Indonesia. And you know, what can the government do? Well, and maybe Jakarta is, I don't know if this room is different or Jakarta is different. And for so many people to have had lunch in the last week with someone not of their religion out in kampung, desa, never, no. And, you know, there's I forget the name of it, there's a pesantren in El Borobudur that regularly participates in soccer tournaments with the Christian schools so that the kids can interact. Now, they interact as opponents on the field, but, you know, we used to think that, you know, the Ministry of Youth and Sports was a throwaway ministry. SBA gave it to PKS on a regular basis. We could rethink about it as the most important ministry. If they set up opportunities for kids not only to play against, but to play sports with people of other ethnic groups, other religious groups on the same team, that is how I would want, I think would be the best way to face off Islamism, or is not straight on, because that's not going to work. Because that's what that's going to do is people who aren't Islamists are going to then support the Islamists. You know, ban Hata'i, and other Muslims who aren't Hata'i say, maybe you shouldn't have banned them. Again, a lived Panchasila, people regularly interacting with people of a different faith. And yeah, I think the sports ministry is the ministry that can make that happen.
Thank you. Okta?
Yeah, with regard to whether or not we are seeing the rise of Islamization in the future, there was a survey conducted by LSE last year that asked people about who's the most popular ulama or Islamic preachers in Indonesia. And then if you look at the result, number one was Abdul Somad. And then Mama Dede came second. And then Arifin Ilham third, Agim, and then Yusuf Mansur. So these five Islamic preachers, these are all individuals who are not necessarily affiliated themselves with two largest Islamic organizations in Indonesia, Nahdlatul Ulama and then Muhammadiyah. These five people, they are most listened by people. So despite the two organizations, they claim that they have millions of supporters, but it turns out that millions of Indonesians are listening more to these individuals, preachers, who don't have, you know, organizations. So I could say that in the future, maybe what we're going to see is more and more independent Muslims who are loosely, you know, coordinated. They are not necessarily affiliate themselves with the established organizations in Indonesia, and then that could lead to many, I think, implications for Indonesian politics in the future. And then the last thing, whether or not we're going to see the rise of Islamism in the future, the way I see it is that in the next 5 years, we're going to see the same political groups, right? PDIP and Jokowi, and then Gerindra and PKS as the core opposition parties in Indonesia. And then I think they can learn from what PDIP did during SBY era. So PDIP, being a consistent opposition for 2 terms of President SBY, 2004 up to 2014, keep, you know, criticizing what SBY did and giving people some alternatives, and then they managed to gain, you know, to perform admirably in some local elections in Indonesia at the time, in West Java. If you recall, Teten Masduki, and then he came second at the time, and then Jokowi won Jakarta, and then also in North Sumatra, and then in Central Java, they won, you know, these gubernatorial elections, and that led to President Jokowi, with Jokowi's winning in 2014, right? Criticizing the government. What does it mean for Gerindra and PKS? If they believe that what they did so far, playing the religious card, is quite effective for them in swaying, you know, people's vote for them, I think they're going to use the same strategy for the next 5 years, and that could make our politics becomes even worse. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, our time is up. I don't know how to summarize. I'm tasked to summarize actually, but I don't know how, Pak Alan, because of the richness of the discussion. But at least I think I can sense that we do have some sort of deadly combination right now. Our institutional setup is not favorable for encouraging less division, as Ibu Titi mentioned, that the threshold, the presidential, to nominate the presidential candidates, kind of producing the division that we have. Maybe that's a homework for all of us, NGOs, academics, to think about. Maybe our institutional setup contributes to the rise of these divisions within our society, and that will require a lot of thinking from us. And on the other hand, our sociological context is now rather difficult. We may see the rise of Islamic formalization, or whatever you call it, but now, and something that is intriguing that Ibu Nafa said, is that maybe the Islamists, the term moderates now becomes kind of adopting conservative sense. And that's something I think very new, because we used to think that Indonesia is a moderate Muslim country and so on, but now it is defined by the conservative. And this is, I think, also another homework for us. We do need to study this. What do we mean by moderates in Indonesia, and how do we tackle through policies and through activities at the national level and on local levels. And lastly, I think suggestion from Professor Ron, I think is very useful, that we need to have a living Pancasila. It's not something that we just cite or we just say, but something really living. It's like living constitution, and now we have to have living Pancasila. And maybe we don't see that much in Jakarta, but I believe in the regions we could still see this living Pancasila thing that we need to focus more on, in discussion. And lastly, I think my initial question to this panel was that, are all this temporary? And I got a sense that it is temporary, because of the election. And then because maybe we just need to adjust our expectation about, a moderation or moderate or the Islamic context in Indonesia. But once I think we can change all the three aspects that I mentioned earlier, maybe then it becomes temporary. So it depends on us, whether or not we are going to have this as a temporary phenomenon, or is it continue. But if we keep silent, maybe then it becomes permanent. But I believe, as Pak Ron already sensed, this is a room that is rather different. This is outliers in the group. In the room is outlier from the Indonesian context. For your information, I think CSIS has the highest density of Minang researcher. Right? So I think we are in the 14, not the 86% of Minang. So I think it's really upon us. Here, I believe, with your organization, there was people from Komnas, Ibu Riri, and so on. It is in our hands of how we are going to do about this, and I believe CSIS is committed to do this, to keep our constitution and to have our living Pancasila. Now, please join me in thanking the fabulous speakers that we have, and of course, thanking all of us for your contribution and your thought. I'll see you, hopefully we can see you in the next event at CSIS. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the speakers and moderator. Next, I would like to invite our moderator and speakers to take a group